It's good to be back with you. In this second of the Newell lectures, I'd like to tell you a story based on my last book, which is on chapters 24 through 27 of the book of Isaiah. But before I do, I'd like to address the question of why this matters. Why is it that scholars of the Bible spend so much of our time trying to figure out who wrote what and when? As I said in my first lecture, context helps us to make sense of stories, just as it helps us to make sense of the world. When we have no context, we cannot make sense of the Bible, and these 4 chapters are a prime example. Estimates of their date have varied by more than 500 years, from the late 8th century to the 1st century AD, and so no one understood it. How could they? If you have a few minutes to read, you might pause this video and read through Isaiah 24 through 27 yourself. That will help you to understand better why these chapters have proven difficult to locate historically. They are nearly bereft of clear historical references, there's not a single person named, and none of the place names is particularly unique to a certain period. Many scholars of previous generations therefore threw up their hands and said that the passage was a fairly incomprehensible mixture of fragments. They have also said that it must have been added to the book very late, around the 3rd century BCE. This is one of the major perspectives. And this is based on certain imagery, for example, of the dead rising and of seemingly apocalyptic destruction and about the gathering of God's people. And so they said that these chapters also had no discernible connection to historical events. Gradually, over the course of a decade of research, those arguments dissolved when I tried to confirm them. Now, traditional scholarship has gotten many things right about the book of Isaiah. There is no doubt, for example, that the book's formation spanned centuries. But this new book does challenge and reshape scholarship on Isaiah 24 through 27 and the formation of the whole book. More importantly, for anyone who cares about the Bible, it makes these chapters understandable. Originally, these chapters celebrated the crumbling of the Neo-Assyrian Empire as an act of divine deliverance. They focused on the fall of the Assyrian imperial citadel at the site of Ramat Rachel near Jerusalem. And they include hymns celebrating what the Judahites described as Yahweh's victory over Assyria, and they exhort the whole local region which Assyria had ruled to reunite with Judah at a moment when that was a plausible choice for the first time in centuries. The withdrawal of Neo-Assyrian forces from the region in the 620s would have left the door open for new political ideas, and it would have been quite natural for a Davidic monarch like Josiah to imagine reuniting the kingdoms in the region. So in what follows, I present in an imaginative way the story of the context and composition of Isaiah 24 through 27. Now behind this lies 200 pages of dense historical argumentation, and I'm going to spare you most of those details for now, though I am happy to talk about them during the Q&A session that is to follow. But if the book's arguments are cogent, then they should cohere when we talk about real authors who wrote a text at a certain historical moment. It should be possible to tell a plausible story. So that's what I'm trying to do here. This story takes place in Jerusalem at the end of the 7th century BC, against the backdrop of the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They were a skilled, high-tech, and terrifying force which was not above using torture to strike fear in their enemies. It had been the largest empire which the region had ever seen, not only powerful militarily, but also a cultural force. It went so far as to hang copies of the treaties it imposed in the temples of its subject nations. And like most empires in their times, it would have seemed indomitable. And Judah submitted to it. In Jerusalem, Josiah had come to the throne in 640 BC, when Judah was still firmly under Assyrian control. That meant heavy taxation and surveillance of Judah's affairs. But near the end of Josiah's lengthy reign, Assyria collapsed. It was conquered by Babylon and its allies in the 610s, having seemingly overextended its reach and left the core of the empire poorly defended. This history of the years between 640 and the end of Assyria is difficult to reconstruct due to a relative shortage of sources, but it appears that the empire's weakness had become clear in provinces like Judah over the course of years, and that Josiah had begun to assert Judah's independence in this period. Nonetheless, the news of Assyria's end could only have been stunning, and that is where we begin. The year then is 612 BC. A messenger arrives at the court in Jerusalem with a letter from the military commander on Judah's northern border. It reports that some traders showed up at the city saying that Nineveh had been conquered and the Assyrian emperor Sen-Sharishkun had disappeared. A hush falls over the reception hall. In spite of all the remarkable news out of the East in recent years about the rise of Babylonian power and the destruction of other major Assyrian cities, the fall of Nineveh still meets with a moment of hesitation, almost disbelief. Then gradually the room erupts in jubilation. The news spreads quickly throughout the palace complex, and not in particularly hushed tones. Eyes shine brighter. Somewhere off in a side room, the news reaches a scribe named Shaphan. In wonderment, he unbends himself from over his parchment and thinks of an old prophetic oracle. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. Where was that scroll? Shaphan thinks to himself, things had not been so bad recently for Judah, even before Nineveh fell. Quality of life for many there had been improving steadily for years. Really, what more could people have asked of Josiah? Granted, in the early years of his reign, the nation had still been firmly under the thumb of Assyria, and the taxes in those days were hard on everyone. But he was just a boy then. Eventually, Josiah had come through on everything you could ask of him. As he rummaged in the archives, Shaphan thought about how this had come about. Already by the late 620s, there were inklings of change. You could feel it around the Assyrian governor's citadel in Ramat Rachel. The luxury and excess that it was known for didn't exactly disappear, but a certain grimness began to overshadow them. Probably the empire's budget was a little tighter with the fighting that Assyria was doing in other parts of the world. And then one day in 614, Judah awoke to find the Assyrians gone, along with some of the locals who had worked closely with them. Other natives in the royal court went up to the hilltop fortress complex, which stood eerily silent now. They had taken everything that wasn't nailed down and had destroyed some of what they left. The Judahites hacked at it a bit more, venting the years of pent-up frustration in largely symbolic vandalism. Some Judahite servants who had been sworn to secrecy during the Assyrian preparations and then left behind now spoke up. They said that the governor's military detachment had been summoned back to the homeland, where it was needed to fight the Babylonians and Medes. Without any protection, the governor had pleaded that he, his family, and his staff must also return to Assyria for the time being. There would be plenty of time, he told the central government, to restore imperial structures in Judah when the crisis had passed. Even the Judahites must have anticipated deep down that the Assyrians would be back, so there was a little celebration then in 614. Things had sat uneasily that way for some time in spite of the substantial relief of throwing off the yoke of Assyrian taxation. Our scribe, Shaphan, knew that changes had been underway in the temple as well, though few outside the palace were aware of it. A cuneiform treaty tablet had long hung there, in the very holy of holies that was most sacred to the Lord, with its interminable demands of the emperor and its lists of foreign gods, right there in the temple. Recently, though, it had disappeared, along with the symbol of Asher that had haunted the sanctuary. On the slide, you have a picture of the ruined temple from an Assyrian site in the same period, and the treaty imposed on them by the Assyrians, which was found there in Tel Tainat. Back in Jerusalem, the temple priests, freed from the impositions of the empire, could be heard shouting praises to the glory of God. Standing there in the presence of the Lord, it was hard not to believe the kings and priests when they credited the God of Israel with the fall of Assyria, even if it was not clear what exactly Judah had done to bring it about. So Josiah orders what he calls a victory feast at his palace on Mount Zion. Bring out the aged wines and don't spare the fatted cattle. The fall of Assyria only happens once. Characteristically, Josiah emphasizes that it is a divine victory, and he invites everyone from the whole country to partake, and of course, to bend the knee in thanks to the God of Israel. Josiah summons the temple scribes to him and asks them to conjure up something good for this special occasion. They take this in stride. They're a seasoned group, flourished under a king who understands the importance of history. Speaking of history, Josiah says to them, "There's one more thing. I want the northerners invited." Now, the former northern kingdom, Israel, had been conquered more than a century earlier and had been partly exiled and repopulated with people from distant regions. As one sees with the later Samaritans in the New Testament, it was condemned by Judahites as an ethnically mixed and theologically corrupt population. So now the scribes' calm veneer cracks. Shaphan is one of the more senior among them, steps forward gingerly. He explains gently that that's not a good idea. Those northerners have never accepted Judah's legitimacy as the true Israel. It's hardly likely that they're going to come bow to Yahweh, to the Lord. Those people are not even the sons of Jacob anymore, not really. They were shipped there by the Assyrians a century ago from God knows where. They wouldn't know Bethel from Sheol. Josiah smiles thinly at these objections, and he nods to a senior advisor who firmly escorts the scribes out. Josiah knows what he's about. He does not suffer from low self-esteem. He's been a king since he was old enough to ride a horse and has presided over a period of a glorious national flourishing. And he has even managed to expand the nation's power and influence, though truth be told, not as much as he would like. Josiah knows the stories of his predecessors, of David and the tens of thousands he killed, of Solomon and his wise administration of a vast territory, and their wealth. To come down to it, that's where the new plan comes in. In spite of the recent improvements and the fact that the Assyrians are no longer patrolling the north, Judah's military has greatly atrophied. The so-called Assyrian peace had long ago disarmed most of the local powers. In recent decades, any Judahite warriors could only have proved themselves in the service of the empire. Judah was not going to overwhelm the north with a few plowshares beaten into swords. So coercion is not an option for now, but maybe persuasion. It's worth a shot, Josiah thinks. All this is conveyed to the scribes, who set aside their old grudges against the north and embrace their task. Shaphan has to admit to himself that stories have power, and in this case, Josiah can tell a pretty compelling one. After all, the Assyrians have not exactly supported native pride in the north. They've crushed it with their constant shuffling of populations. These people barely know who they are or where they are compared to proud Judah. Who would not then want to buy into this story about native rule at a time when there's no ruler in the land? And Josiah treats his people well. After all, the people of the land put him in power. But like David, that humble shepherd boy, he could unite a nation. Shaphan now recalls where he read that line about the one who laid nations low being cut to the ground. He locates a scroll with a few oracles from his grandfather's or great-grandfather's time compiled on it. The oracles, from almost a century ago, are attributed to Isaiah ben Amoz. Shaphan reads about the defeated king being cast out from his grave. Perhaps this happened to the last king of Assyria after the fall of Nineveh, or to his forefathers' graves at Kala, perhaps. This has not been reported to Shaphan, but the rest fits so well. He decides that it is quite plausibly a prophecy of these very times. This passage from Isaiah is in a collection of oracles about foreign nations. And Shaphan, digging deeper, finds other remarkable resonances with his own time. He eventually takes up a passage about the utter despoilment of the whole land because it treats everyone the same, which Josiah will like and think is appropriate. It will be the same for the people as for the priest, etc. This is indeed what it was like when the Assyrians were in control of Judah. The whole world seemed to be literally falling apart, even the natural order of things. Every wise person knows that the land flourishes under good rule and suffers under bad rule. And why did this happen? Shaphan's mind drifts to Josiah's tearing his clothes years earlier. It happened because the people had broken the ancient covenant that was found in the temple, because there had been no one to propagate it. Thus, Shaphan sets the background for the composition that he envisions. He goes on. The Assyrian citadel that brought chaos to Judah is shattered, and its houses are shut up, and the people burst into song at this harvest, giving thanks to Yahweh. Times have been dark indeed, but the day of the Lord is always on the horizon, the day on which the rulers of the earth will receive God's justice, and even the heavenly powers thought to be divine by others will pale in comparison. With the problem established and its solution proclaimed, Shaphan offers a hymn evoking the ancient battle songs of the nation in honor of the victorious divine warrior. O Lord, you are my God, and I will exalt you. The Lord is the one who has destroyed the enemy oppressors and their fortified palace. The Lord is also the host of the feast that Josiah has ordered. Foreign domination of Judah has been like a living death for so many years, but now the Lord has turned the tables on death as the mighty mythological swallower, and the Lord has himself swallowed death up. Then the scribes compose a further song for Jerusalem itself. It had been dominated, perhaps, but never conquered. The Assyrian citadel has fallen, but not Zion. We have a strong city, they say, with fortifications that God himself protects, a rock of ages worthy of the people's trust. Now, the people may not all be as wealthy or powerful as some whom Shaphan has seen. After decades of watching the Assyrians parade through Judah in their fine clothes and plant their ostentatious exotic gardens, this is burned into his mind. But the Judahites are righteous, and that's what matters to God. That's why he delivers them and consumes their enemies. On the heels of this celebration, one of the scribes decides that confession is necessary as well. In keeping with the perspective of the second scroll of the law, it is important to recognize God's role in the nation's history. This is a good time, he thinks, to admit that the people have achieved no victories on their own. Rather, it is the Lord who has somehow, in his inscrutable providence, expanded their boundaries. It is, once again, the Lord who has saved them from this state of death. Who else has the power to kill or give life? Another old scroll occurs to Shaphan now. He recalls some oracles brought to Jerusalem by a refugee a long time ago, written in a funny dialect from the north. This is his segue. These oracles were meant for the kings of the north, after all, telling them to return to the Lord. These northerners, too, had been raised up from the dead. It's a natural and powerful way to invite these northerners now, it seems to him. Just as Isaiah foresaw the fall of the Assyrians, this prophet, Hosea, foresaw the restoration of the north at just such a time as this, and also in terms of being raised from the dead. Yes, there will be hard times still to come. The Assyrians' withdrawal from the land will, admittedly, result in some temporary chaos. Someone else will have to step up and keep the peace in outlying areas, and until then, the roads and even the cities may be dangerous. It would be wise for people to keep their doors locked until the wrath passes by. Shaphan returns to a metaphor that is well used among the Lord's spokesmen, the land as the vineyard of God. He recalls it somewhere in the Isaiah material as well, what's now chapter 5 as it happens, but he doesn't look at it. He knows what he needs to say. The south was warned and punished and chastened and returned to the Lord and has been blessed like a fruitful vineyard. So too must the north now, if it is to be reunified with God's true people. This is the climactic moment of the whole passage, the climactic call. Let the north be reunified with Judah. The Lord who reigns on Zion says, I have no wrath. Let it make peace with me. For this to happen, though, the north must tear down all of the cultic sites and the paraphernalia that have long stood in the way of its true knowledge of God. Then they can be regathered from Assyria, where they had been taken, if you read 2 Kings 17, and from Egypt, where they had fled. They are summoned with the blast of the shofar, the horn, which is a traditional symbol of the unification of the tribes, going back to Judges 3:27 or Numbers 10:3. The so-called victory feast at which Shaphan's scroll was read was a high-spirited affair. Wine flowed freely, but there was scarcely anyone but the Judahites in attendance in spite of the invitations. Arguably, that should have given them a premonition. Later, it was all a bitter memory for Shaphan. To those who met him after Josiah died, he looked older than his years. To Judah, it felt like no sooner had Assyria collapsed than the Egyptian and Babylonian armies were passing through their land. This vision of a new, greater Israel had proven a phantom. Even the Egyptians, who had usually been content to let Judah run its own affairs in the past, had apparently decided that Josiah had forgotten his place and become inconvenient. And so the Pharaoh Necho killed Josiah in 609, 3 years after this festival. He agreed with Jeremiah that Josiah's son and successor Jehoiakim was not a worthy heir to the throne. The new king found himself caught in between the great world powers. To the few that Shaphan trusted, he was prone to grumble darkly, no spine at all, that one, meaning Jehoiakim, always chasing after whichever foreign power is in fashion this month. But neither could Shaphan look back to Josiah's reign as a golden age, as some did. He had shaken everything up, had departed from many of the old ways, and for what? No wonder Judah no longer knew which way to turn. They were so torn among so many different worldviews now. Even Shaphan's own sons and grandsons seemed to have lost their way. Shaphan was spared seeing his city looted and its temple burned. He died even before the Babylonians first campaigned to Jerusalem in 597. Somewhere in the temple complex, his festival scroll sat among records of oracles of both earlier and later prophets. When the end came, someone gathered them up and saved them from the conflagration. This part of the story is fuzzy, to say the least, but we know that Jehoiakim had courtiers with him in exile in Babylon because records of their rations have survived. When Judahites returned from exile after Cyrus's edict freed them, there was a prophet among them who was inspired by the words of Isaiah. Somewhere along the way, Shaphan's scroll and the one that inspired it were also combined together, and many similar words were added to them. This new enlarged scroll was itself a masterpiece that spoke to new generations, so that promises like "your dead shall live" took on new meanings. The book of Isaiah, as it came to be, was so powerful that people forgot what the scroll had been about. Even the well-intentioned and expert scribes who compiled and reimagined the words of the prophets forgot. They recalled the great moments in history, like Jerusalem's survival of the siege in 701, or the war between Judah and the Syro-Ephraimitic coalition in the 730s. But the failed hopes of just a moment at the end of the reign of Judah's last great king in 612, its poetry ensured that it endured, but it was a vanished dream. The north never made peace with Judah and the Lord. The nations never came to the table. Josiah never ruled as a new David. What sense could it all make to readers a century later, let alone 26 centuries later? What we read now in Isaiah 24 through 27 is not exactly Josiah's festival scroll, just as the book of Deuteronomy is not exactly Josiah's law book, and the books of Joshua through 2 Kings are not exactly his history. Each one is layered over and reworked, and is ultimately, in its present form, a product of the post-exilic period, if not later. Still, if we excavate each of these literary works in an archaeological manner, we find literary remains of the Davidic monarchy. Scholars will differ about the extent to which these works are shattered pots. Some say that we have only fragments of their original forms. Having spent many years sifting through the remains of Isaiah and brushing at its pieces, though, I see this coherent story in chapters 24 through 27, where others have seen only a mess. It certainly needs to be pieced back together in places, and various additions and modifications intrude here and there, but we can see clearly how it celebrates the end of Assyrian power, calls people to confess their dependence on God, and summons the north to reunify with Judah in the name of the Lord.